It was hard to pinpoint exactly when everything started to feel so right. Elena and I, Victor Jennings, had built our life piece by piece, a steady rhythm that echoed the simplicity we both wanted. When I met her, she wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but her quiet strength was magnetic. We were introduced through mutual friends, and from the very beginning, we connected over our shared dreams of simplicity. A house with a garden, dinners together without the distractions of the outside world, weekends spent in lazy conversation or taking the kids on spontaneous adventures. Life felt manageable, almost like we were sculpting something perfect. We weren't flashy, we didn't need to be. Elena was always there for me. Always present, always with that soft smile that could calm any storm in my life. And our children, Rachel and Sophie, gave us purpose. Every parent tells you that children are the heartbeat of your home, and I believed it. It was true, especially in those early years. They made us laugh, made us feel like we had a deeper sense of responsibility, and for a long time I thought that this was it. This was the dream. The years passed, and slowly we got comfortable. Too comfortable. Elena and I settled into patterns. I was the marketing manager for a small but successful company in Sacramento, and she had put her career on hold to focus on the family. Our lives revolved around routines, breakfasts, school runs, work, dinner, repeat. At first, it wasn't anything that seemed abnormal, but as time went on, I realized something was starting to slip. I would come home and see Elena sitting on the couch, her eyes fixed on the TV, but there was a distance in them. It wasn't a big change, not something you could point to and say, "That's it, that's where it started to fall apart." But it was there, an ever so subtle shift. I didn't like to admit it, but part of me had become complacent. The business of life, the daily grind, had taken precedence over our relationship. Conversations that once buzzed with excitement had turned into logistics. "What time will you be home? Do you want chicken or pasta?" I ignored it. We had 2 beautiful daughters, a home, jobs. What else could we need? But it was more than that, wasn't it? I felt the distance growing, but I didn't know how to bridge it. Maybe I was too distracted, too focused on the promotions at work, the deadlines, the expectations of success. And maybe she, Elena, had started feeling the same way. I should have seen it coming. I should have asked. But it was easier to ignore. After all, this was the life we had built, wasn't it? A safe, predictable life. I thought we were in sync. I thought we were both content. But I was wrong. One evening I came home after another long day. Elena was in the kitchen, her back turned to me, humming as she chopped vegetables for dinner. It should have been normal, our usual routine. But something felt off. I said her name, but she didn't answer. I thought it was nothing, maybe she hadn't heard me, but she always heard me. I shrugged it off. There were more pressing things to think about. As the night went on, things felt more disjointed. I tried to make small talk, but Elena's responses were absent, detached. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to admit it. So I did what any husband would do in a moment of discomfort. I ignored it. After dinner, we sat down on the couch together. Rachel and Sophie were upstairs, settled into their evening routines. There was a quiet in the room, a heaviness that seemed to settle between us, like a blanket we hadn't asked for but couldn't shake off. Elena asked how my day had gone. "I got the promotion," I said, trying to inject some excitement into my voice, but even I could hear the lack of enthusiasm in it. "That's great," she replied, but her words felt hollow, distant. It wasn't that she didn't care, I told myself. She had to care. She just didn't know how to express it anymore. Life was moving too fast, and we had both gotten caught up in the momentum. I tried to push the thought aside, but it lingered. Then she said something that knocked me off balance. It wasn't even a big revelation, but it was enough to shatter the illusion I had been holding on to. "I think we need to talk," Elena said, her voice soft, but her eyes avoided mine. "I think I want a divorce." The words didn't register at first. Divorce. She wanted a divorce. I sat there, stunned. I didn't know how to respond. My mind spun in 1,000 directions, none of them making sense. "What?" was all I could manage. Elena hesitated, looking down at her hands, then met my eyes with a kind of sadness I hadn't seen in years. "I met someone else," she whispered. My chest tightened. I couldn't breathe. She hadn't just grown distant. She hadn't just been tired or stressed. She had met someone else. I wanted to scream, to shout, to demand answers, but all I could do was sit there, feeling my heart sink. I didn't know how to process it. 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, none of them coherent. Was this real? Was she serious? My brain refused to accept it. I'd been so sure we were fine, so sure we were solid. But now everything felt like it was crumbling. I didn't want to admit it, but deep down, I knew the cracks had been there for a long time. We'd been too comfortable, too predictable, and now I was about to learn that even the most stable foundations can erode if you don't nurture them. It started with the smallest things, little cracks in the perfect veneer of our life. At first I barely noticed them. Maybe it was the rush of work, the demands of the kids, or just the sheer exhaustion of living day to day. But over time, those cracks grew, and I couldn't ignore them anymore. It wasn't anything blatant. It wasn't a fight or a confrontation. It was more subtle than that. A shift, a distance between us that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I remember how it began, quietly. Elena and I would sit together in the evening after the kids had gone to bed. We'd always talked about our day, about everything from work to the small things happening around the house. But gradually our conversations started to change. They became more like exchanges of information than shared moments of connection. I remember one night after dinner, I asked her how her day had been. It wasn't an unusual question. I asked it every day. But this time she didn't answer right away. She just looked at me like she was lost in thought, her fingers absently twisting a napkin on the table. It felt like she was somewhere else, like she wasn't really there with me. "Fine," she said, almost too quickly, as if she were trying to brush past it. There was no warmth in her voice, no smile, just nothing. It wasn't the Elena I knew, the one who would laugh at my stupid jokes or tell me about her latest project. This woman sitting across from me felt like a stranger, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't say anything that night. I told myself I was overthinking it, that I was just tired. But it didn't stop there. The next few weeks, the distance only widened. Elena started to withdraw more. She'd leave the room when I walked in, as if there was something she didn't want me to see. She stopped sharing the small, trivial details of her day. No more stories about the kids at school or the neighbors' gossip. She became quiet, reserved, and when I tried to fill the silence, it was like I was talking to a wall. I began to wonder if she was unhappy. Maybe she was tired of being at home all the time. Maybe she wanted more. I tried to bring it up once, gently. "Is everything okay?" I asked one evening as we sat in our living room, the soft light of the lamp casting shadows on her face. She gave me a small, tight smile and nodded. "Yeah, just tired," she said. "You know, with the girls and everything." It was a rehearsed answer, the kind of answer that told me she was deflecting, not being entirely truthful. But I didn't press her. I didn't want to seem paranoid. After all, what was there to worry about? We had a solid life together, a family. We had everything we needed. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was slipping through my fingers. I began to notice even smaller things, like how she'd stop texting me back as quickly, or how her phone was always face down on the table when she wasn't using it. It seemed like nothing at first, but then it became a pattern, and patterns I knew weren't accidental. One night, when I was working late, I found myself checking our bank account, just a quick glance to make sure everything was in order. As I scrolled through the transactions, something caught my eye. A small charge at a fancy restaurant I didn't recognize. I frowned, thinking it was probably just something for one of the kids, but there were no receipts in the kitchen, no mention of it at all. It was odd, and it bothered me. I told myself it was nothing, just an oversight, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I started to keep a closer eye on Elena, watching for more signs, and the more I watched, the more I saw. Her late nights out, claiming she was meeting friends, but never mentioning who. The way she seemed distracted when I tried to talk to her. The way she would retreat into the bedroom late in the evening, shutting the door behind her, leaving me in the quiet house, alone with my thoughts. I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that she was just tired or stressed. But something inside me, something that I couldn't ignore any longer, told me that it was more than that. The thought began to gnaw at me like a slow burning fuse. Was she seeing someone else? Was she tired of me? Or was I just being paranoid? I wanted to ask her, but I was afraid of what I might hear. What if I was right? What if the woman I had loved, the mother of my children, had found someone else? The fear was suffocating. I tried to push it away, but every time I looked at her, every time I felt the cold distance between us, the question would creep back into my mind. What's really going on? And no matter how much I tried to dismiss it, I couldn't escape the feeling that the truth was just around the corner, waiting for me to finally face it. The house was too quiet that evening. I had returned home from work later than usual, expecting the usual warm greetings, the chatter of the girls, the smell of Elena's cooking filling the air. But instead, the silence welcomed me, heavy and suffocating. I dropped my keys on the counter, calling out to Elena, but only my voice bounced back at me. The kids weren't home. Rachel was at a friend's house, and Sophie was out with her classmates for a school event. I felt a sense of unease settle in the pit of my stomach. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt peaceful or comfortable. It was the kind that makes your skin crawl, as if something was lurking just out of view. My mind raced back to the small signs I had been brushing off. The missed conversations, the distracted looks, the way Elena would retreat into herself whenever I tried to connect. But I still didn't want to believe it. I still clung to the hope that it was just a phase, that everything would be fine if we could just talk. But when I stepped into the living room, there she was, sitting on the couch, her legs tucked under her, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Elena had always been graceful, but tonight she looked small, fragile, like the woman I once knew was slipping away from me. She didn't look up when I entered the room. That silence between us stretched longer than it should have. I took a deep breath and sat next to her. "Hey, what's going on?" I asked gently, trying to keep my voice steady. She met my eyes, but there was something different there, something I couldn't quite place. The warmth that once radiated from her was gone, replaced by something colder, more distant. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line, before she spoke in a voice that seemed to come from far away. "I think we need to talk," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze. I had been expecting this conversation for weeks now, but hearing those words felt like a punch to the gut. My mind went blank for a moment. "What do you mean?" I asked, already sensing that what was coming would shatter everything. Elena took a slow breath, her eyes avoiding mine as if looking at me directly might make what she was about to say too real. "Victor," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I've made up my mind. I want a divorce." The words hit me like a wave. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. My heart raced in my chest, but my body felt frozen. I stared at her, searching her face for any sign of regret, any flicker of the love we had once shared. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. "Divorce?" I finally managed to choke out, the word tasting foreign on my tongue. "Elena, what? Why?" She closed her eyes briefly, like she was steeling herself for what came next. When she opened them again, she looked at me with a kind of sorrowful resignation that I couldn't comprehend. "I've met someone else," she said, her voice trembling. "Someone who understands me. Someone who makes me feel alive again." The room spun. I heard her words, but they didn't make sense. My mind couldn't wrap itself around them. Elena, my Elena, the woman who had been my partner for so long, the mother of our children, had found someone else? I felt sick to my stomach, the pain crawling up my chest, making it hard to breathe. "I don't want to hurt you," she continued, her eyes welling up. "I never meant for this to happen. It just did." I couldn't believe it. I had felt the distance, the shift in her behavior, but I never imagined this. A part of me had been bracing for something like this, but hearing it out loud made it too real. My mind raced. Who was he? How long had it been going on? Why hadn't she told me? The anger surged through me, but it was buried beneath a blanket of disbelief. I wanted to shout, to demand answers, but the words stuck in my throat. I wasn't angry, at least not yet. I was just lost. I had spent so many years building this life, this family, and now it felt like it was all slipping through my fingers. "Is it serious?" I asked, my voice trembling despite my efforts to keep it steady. She hesitated, her gaze falling to the floor as if the answer pained her. "Yes, I think so," she whispered. I sat there staring at her in shock. 1,000 thoughts flooded my mind, but none of them made sense. How had we gotten here? We had built something beautiful, something solid. What had happened? How had I missed it? "I never wanted this," Elena said, her voice breaking. "But I can't keep pretending. I don't love you the way I used to." It felt like she had just slapped me. The words weren't just painful, they were a betrayal. My mind spun trying to process what she had just said. "You don't love me?" The question came out before I could stop it, my voice sounding weaker than I wanted. Elena didn't answer right away. She seemed to shrink in on herself, and in that moment I saw her for the first time as a woman who was lost, just as much as I was. "I never meant for things to get this far," she whispered. "But I have to be true to myself. I've made my decision, Victor. I'm sorry." And with those words, everything I had known about my life crumbled. I had never imagined I would be sitting here hearing my wife tell me she was leaving. Not just leaving, but leaving for someone else. The reality of it settled in like a stone in my stomach, and I couldn't escape it. She stood up, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was already gone in her mind. "I'll move out tomorrow," she said quietly, her back turned to me. I wanted to scream, to beg her to stay, but I didn't. I just sat there in the silence that followed, the weight of her words hanging in the air. The next few days blurred into one long, dark tunnel. I kept asking myself the same questions over and over. Why did she do it? How could she betray everything we built? And most importantly, who was he? I hadn't known what to expect after Elena's confession, but it sure as hell wasn't the crushing emptiness that followed. The house felt alien now, like a place I was just passing through, a place that didn't hold the meaning it once had. Everything felt so stark, so cold. It was like the walls were pressing in on me and I couldn't breathe. But then something inside me snapped. I couldn't just sit around, wallowing in this endless sea of pain. No, I had to know more. I had to understand everything. Who was the man who had taken my wife? What had he promised her? What kind of future did he offer her that I couldn't? The thought of Elena with someone else, someone who had somehow swept her off her feet, made her forget everything, was unbearable. So I started. Quietly at first, trying not to make any waves. I wasn't sure where to begin, but I had to start somewhere. I went through her things. I wasn't proud of it, but it was the only way to start finding answers. Elena's things had always been organized, neat. It wasn't hard to find her phone, tucked away on the dresser, her phone. The thing she had been glued to lately, the thing that had always been face down when I walked into a room. I hadn't wanted to look at it, hadn't wanted to invade her privacy. But that was before she'd told me everything was over. I picked it up cautiously, but my hands were shaking. The last thing I wanted was to stumble upon something that would rip open the wound even further, but I had no choice. I unlocked it easily. Elena's code was simple, something I'd always known. As the screen lit up, I felt a chill in my spine. There were dozens of messages, but none from me. I scrolled, and there it was, the name, Jacob Dawson. My heart sank. I knew that name. The CEO of a tech company based in Silicon Valley. Rich, powerful. The kind of man who could offer Elena a life I never could. I read through the messages, feeling like I was watching the last shreds of my dignity slip away. There was nothing outright explicit, but the tone, the language, they were more than just friendly. They were intimate. I scrolled through more messages, dates, calls, plans for meeting. They'd been seeing each other for months at least. I felt my stomach twist. He had been there all along while I was blinded by the illusion of a perfect life. A perfect marriage. All those late nights she claimed were work were just excuses to be with him. I wasn't stupid. I knew what this meant. I had been trying to convince myself that there was some innocent explanation, that maybe she was just confused, but the truth was staring me in the face. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a simple affair. This was her choosing him over me. I shut off her phone and placed it back where I found it. I couldn't keep looking at it. It made me sick. But now I knew. I had a name. Jacob Dawson. I could track him down. I could find out everything about him, his background, his business dealings, what made him so irresistible that my wife had decided to throw away everything we had. But the thought of confronting Elena right away didn't sit well with me. Not yet. She had already made her decision, and I was still reeling from the blow. What I needed now wasn't another fight, wasn't more accusations thrown at her. I needed answers. I needed to understand. And maybe, just maybe, there was a part of me that needed some form of revenge. I hated that part of me, but it was there. I spent the next several days gathering information. I wasn't a private investigator, but I had learned a lot over the years, and I was determined. I dug into Jacob Dawson's company, his history. He was a tech mogul, sure, but there was something else behind the man, the way his wealth seemed to come out of nowhere. There were rumors, connections to some powerful people in the business world, and I could see it now, the allure. He wasn't just rich, he was dangerous in a way I hadn't fully understood before. I wasn't just looking for answers anymore. I was looking for the cracks in his life, the things he'd been hiding. If I could find them, maybe I could hurt him the way he had hurt me. It wasn't a proud thought, but it was there. I'd spent years building my life, my family, and this man had torn it all apart in a matter of months. Maybe if I understood him, I could understand why. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way to make him pay. The more I found, the more consumed I became. My mind raced from one piece of information to the next, trying to connect the dots, trying to make sense of it all. But the more I dug, the more I realized that there was no simple explanation, no easy answers. Elena had made her choice, but Jacob Dawson had turned everything I thought I knew into a nightmare. I wasn't just going to sit back and let it happen. I needed to know everything. I had to. The weight of what I had learned sat like a lead ball in my chest, suffocating me. Jacob Dawson, the man who had stolen Elena's heart. I could feel the rage bubbling up inside me as I replayed the messages, the late-night calls, the secrecy. How had it gone so far? How had he convinced her to leave me behind? I couldn't wait anymore. I had to confront him. I had to confront them both. I couldn't just sit here, stewing in the mess he had made of my life. The thought of Elena with him, of their laughter and their whispers in the dark, was unbearable. I needed to know why. Why him? Why wasn't I enough? It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was personal. I couldn't stand the idea of him walking away unscathed, untouched by the destruction he had caused. I wasn't sure what I was going to do when I found him, but I knew I couldn't let it slide. Not after everything. I took a deep breath and grabbed my phone. The search for his contact information had taken me days, but it was finally time. I scrolled to the number I had found in Elena's texts. There it was, the line that had been tying them together in ways I never could have imagined. My finger hovered over the dial button for a moment, my heart pounding in my ears. Before I could back out, I pressed it. The phone rang 3 times before he picked up. His voice was smooth, confident, as if he had all the time in the world. "Hello?" "Jacob Dawson," I said, my voice steady, though my insides were in turmoil. "We need to talk." There was a pause. I could almost hear the gears turning in his mind, probably trying to place me. His tone shifted, slightly guarded. "Who is this?" "Victor Jennings," I replied, the words thick with venom. "I think you know who I am." Another pause. Then a low chuckle, like he was amused by my presence in his life. "Ah, the husband. I figured it was only a matter of time before you called." The audacity of him, the calmness, as if this was some kind of game. I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. "I want to meet you," I said, my words clipped, controlled. "We have a lot to discuss." There was no hesitation in his reply. "Sure. I'll be in town tomorrow. Why don't we meet at the cafe by the park? Say 2 p.m.? I didn't even have to think about it. I didn't care where. I just needed to see him face to face, to see the man who had taken everything I had built. Fine, I'll be there. I ended the call, and the silence that followed felt deafening. My mind raced. What was I going to say? What could I possibly say to him? He had already won, hadn't he? He had Elena. But I still needed answers. I needed to see the face of the man who had pulled her away from me, from us. I spent the night sleepless. I kept replaying the conversation in my mind, trying to anticipate every possible outcome. I was torn between wanting to shout at him, to tear him apart for what he had done, and the nagging feeling that deep down I was losing. I had already lost. The next day I stood outside the cafe at 2 p.m., my hands shoved into my pockets, my breath coming out in small, controlled bursts. I saw him before he saw me, tall, confident, and wearing that same smirk I had imagined 100 times. He walked in like he owned the place, like this was his world and I was just passing through. He spotted me immediately, of course. Why wouldn't he? He had been with Elena. He knew how to read her, how to read people like me. "Victor," he said, his voice smooth and almost mocking. "Glad you could make it." I stood up and met his gaze. There was no shaking hands, no pleasantries, just the cold, hard stare of a man who was fully aware of what he had done. "Let's get to the point," I said, cutting straight to it. "Why? Why her? What makes you think you're entitled to my wife?" Jacob took a seat across from me, unruffled, like this conversation didn't matter in the slightest. He leaned back in his chair, his hands casually folded in front of him. "She's a beautiful woman, smart, kind. She deserves more than what you could offer her." The words stung, but I refused to show it. Instead, I leaned forward, my voice low. "What exactly is it that you think you gave her? A few nice dinners, a fancy house, a life of luxury? She was everything to me, and you took that from me." He smiled then, a slow, almost predatory grin. "I didn't take anything. She came to me, Victor. You've been too busy with your little world, neglecting her, while I gave her something real, something exciting." I felt the heat rise in my chest, my hands trembling at my sides. I wanted to lash out to hurt him the way he had hurt me, but I kept it together. Barely. "And what's that exactly? A few stolen moments, a fleeting fantasy?" Jacob's grin widened. "Call it whatever you want. But the truth is, she wanted to leave. She needed to leave. You didn't see it, but I did. And that's what made me her choice. I felt like I had been slapped across the face, the final blow. The realization that this wasn't just about him, this was about her, too. Elena had made a choice. I stood up, the urge to leave now stronger than ever, but before I turned away, I looked him dead in the eye. "You may have her for now, but you'll never have what we had, and one day you'll find out how empty that really is." Jacob didn't say a word. He didn't need to. He already knew. He had won, and I was left standing in the ruins of my own life. I woke up the next morning to a strange kind of numbness, like my mind was in a fog, trying to make sense of what I had learned. The conversation with Jacob replayed in my head, his smug expression, the way he spoke so casually about taking something that was never his to begin with. It should have angered me more, but I felt too empty to be truly furious. Instead, I had a sickening feeling, one that I couldn't shake, like I was drowning in a sea of questions, all leading back to Elena. I thought I had known her. I had loved her for so many years. But now, nothing about her seemed familiar. Jacob had made it clear that he was her choice, that she had walked away from me. But why? What had changed? What was it that he gave her that I couldn't? I couldn't just sit around anymore. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I couldn't let the pieces of this puzzle stay scattered. I had to understand why my wife had chosen him. I was drowning in this whirlwind of doubt, and the only way out was to uncover the truth, even if it tore me apart. I started with her things again. I told myself I wouldn't look. I promised I wouldn't invade her privacy any more than I already had. But the urge was too strong. I needed to know what was hidden beneath the surface, what Elena wasn't telling me. There was still so much I didn't understand. It started with her emails. She had always been careful about keeping her account secure. She had a separate email for everything, personal, professional, and everything in between. But somehow, I had the password. It wasn't a proud moment for me, but I had learned to read the little clues that she left behind. I logged in, my fingers trembling. The inbox was a mix of banal, work-related messages and newsletters, but the outbox, there it was, messages to Jacob. My heart pounded as I clicked on one of the threads. There were dozens of them, dating back months, hidden beneath the layers of work and routine. She had kept them well hidden, each message carefully crafted. But now, as I scrolled through them, the cold reality set in. What I found didn't make sense. They were filled with words of longing, shared frustrations, promises. Elena had built a relationship with him over time, one that ran far deeper than just physical attraction. This wasn't some fling. This was an affair, yes, but it was more than that. It was emotional. It was real. There was one message that stopped me cold. Elena had written, "I've never felt this alive. He makes me feel like I'm worth something again, like I matter." I read those words over and over again, each time they hit harder. What had I missed? Was I not enough for her? Had she felt so invisible in our marriage that she had to turn to someone else for validation? I wasn't ready to confront her again, not yet. The messages were enough to prove my worst fears. But I needed more. I needed to understand everything. I needed to know what had led her to him. Was it just boredom? A desire for excitement? Or was there something more to it? Was it a sign of deeper issues in our relationship that I had ignored for too long? I spent the day retracing our history, going through old photographs, rereading old letters we had written each other. It felt like digging through a graveyard of memories, only now I was seeing things through a different lens. The smiles in those photos seemed so distant, so far removed from the woman I had known. The love we once shared felt like a lie, a well-constructed facade that I had built around myself. The truth about the affair wasn't just in the messages, the secret meetings, the hidden phone calls. It was in the way she had stopped being herself in our marriage, how she had withdrawn without ever truly leaving. It was the emptiness I had felt in her for months, even before I had suspected anything. I had seen the signs. I had just been too blind, too proud to acknowledge them. I could feel the anger rising inside me now, but it wasn't just directed at Jacob. It was directed at Elena, too. How could she do this to me? How could she do this to our family? I wasn't a perfect husband, far from it. But I had given everything I had to this marriage, and she had thrown it away. She had thrown me away. I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to confront her. I had to make her face the truth, to make her explain herself. I didn't care if it destroyed everything. I needed closure. I needed to look her in the eye and demand an answer for why our entire life together had been a lie. But before I could pick up the phone, something else caught my eye. It was a slip of paper hidden beneath a pile of old receipts in one of her drawers. My heart skipped a beat when I saw what was written on it. A name. Jackie Foster, the name of a divorce lawyer. My stomach dropped. Elena had already started the process. She had made her decision, and it wasn't just about leaving me for Jacob. She was already planning the future without me. I wasn't just losing my wife, I was losing everything. The truth had been right in front of me all along, buried under layers of lies and half-truths. But now that I had uncovered it, I was left with nothing but a choice: move forward or fall into the abyss. I spent the next few days consumed by one thought. Who was Jacob Dawson? The man who had invaded my life, the man who had taken everything from me. I couldn't sit idle anymore. Elena was gone, but the one thing that still gnawed at me was him. I had already seen the messages, read the words they had exchanged. But that wasn't enough. I needed to know who he really was. I wasn't a private investigator, but I had my ways. Over the years, I had learned to read between the lines, to piece things together. And what I found sent chills down my spine. Jacob Dawson was not just some random wealthy man. No, he had a past, a complicated one. He wasn't just a CEO, he was a man with connections, some of them darker than I had imagined. I found articles about his company, his rise to power. They all painted him as a self-made success, a man who had worked his way to the top of the tech world. But there were whispers in the background, too. Whispers about shady business deals, rumored associations with people whose names you never heard without fear. Powerful men who got things done in ways that weren't exactly legal. It was when I dug into his personal life that the picture began to take shape. Jacob had been married before, twice, and both marriages had ended abruptly. No messy divorces, just a quiet, almost cold ending to each relationship. His first wife was a businesswoman, his second was an artist. Both women, it seemed, had walked away without looking back. The common thread? Him. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the truth slowly sinking in. This man wasn't just a charming CEO. He was a man who had a way of making people disappear from his life when they no longer served a purpose. It made sense, didn't it? Elena wasn't the first woman to fall for his charm. She was just the most recent. I felt a strange satisfaction in knowing this. The more I learned about him, the more I realized that he wasn't the perfect man Elena had idealized. He was just a man with power and money, someone who could manipulate people the way he wanted. And Elena had fallen for it. She had fallen for him the way a lot of women seem to fall for men like him, charmed by the glitz, the glamour, the promise of something more. But this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about me, about us, about the family I had lost, the life I had built with Elena. He hadn't just taken her from me. He had taken her from everything we had ever dreamed of together. I wasn't just angry now. I was cold, calculating. I couldn't do anything to change the past, but I sure as hell could find a way to make Jacob Dawson regret ever stepping into my life. The more I learned about him, the more I wanted to know. I tracked down his business partners, his associates. I even found his previous addresses, the places he had lived in over the years. The more I dug, the more I began to realize that Jacob wasn't just a tech mogul with a shady past. He was a man with a calculated charm, someone who knew exactly what he was doing. And that's what had made him so dangerous. Elena had never known the full extent of his world, of the power he wielded behind closed doors. I couldn't blame her for being swept up in it. What choice did she have when someone like Jacob made her feel like she was the center of his universe? I was no longer the man who made her feel important. He had become that man. And in the process, he had taken everything from me. The anger that had been simmering inside me began to transform into something else, a cold determination. I had been a passive player in this entire ordeal, letting things unfold without truly understanding what was at stake. But not anymore. I had a new mission now, to uncover everything about Jacob, every secret, every lie. He had taken my wife, but I wasn't going to let him get away with it. I wasn't going to let Elena get away with it either. I needed to confront him, but I had to be smart about it. I couldn't afford to lose control, not now. I began reaching out to people who might have known him better, people who had crossed paths with him in the past. Some of them were hesitant to speak, but others, when I offered the right incentives, gave me pieces of the puzzle I was desperately trying to put together. Slowly but surely, the story of Jacob Dawson's life unraveled before me, and I saw him for what he truly was, a man who had manipulated his way through life, leaving a trail of broken hearts and shattered families in his wake. And then, just as I thought I had reached the end of the road, something caught my eye. A name, Jackie Foster, the divorce lawyer Elena had been in contact with. He was the final piece, the link that tied it all together. Elena had already begun the process, and the truth about her feelings for Jacob was clearer than ever. I leaned back in my chair, my fists clenched at my sides. The path ahead was clear now. I wasn't just going to stand idly by while Jacob Dawson destroyed everything I had worked for. The game had changed, and I was ready to play. I had gotten what I wanted. I knew about Jacob. I knew about the affair. I knew Elena had already started the process of walking away from everything. But what I hadn't realized, what I hadn't truly understood, was how deep this mess really ran. The more I dug into Jacob's life, the more I uncovered, the more I realized that this wasn't just about a man who had taken my wife. No, it was something far bigger, far more dangerous. Jacob Dawson wasn't just a wealthy CEO with a charming smile. He was someone who operated in the shadows, someone who had connections in places I couldn't even begin to imagine. And now I had unknowingly thrust myself into the midst of it all. It started to hit me as I was researching his history, connecting dots, piecing together the puzzle. Jacob wasn't just a man who had hurt me emotionally. He was a man who had ties to people who didn't care about family, about morals, about anything except power and money. As I started digging deeper, I realized that there were rumors surrounding his business practices, shady deals, people who had mysteriously disappeared. It was unsettling. The more I learned, the more I realized I was getting too close to something I wasn't prepared for. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon. I had just returned from work, still processing everything I had uncovered. I was sitting in the kitchen, running through my notes, when my phone rang. The number wasn't familiar, but something told me I needed to answer. "Victor Jennings," the voice on the other end said, low and controlled. "We need to talk." I froze. The voice was calm, too calm, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. It was a voice that belonged to someone who wasn't just trying to intimidate, but someone who had power, real power. "Who is this?" I asked, my throat dry. "Let's just say I work for someone who's become very interested in you," the voice replied, its tone icy. "And I suggest you stop digging into things that don't concern you. You're poking around where you don't belong." The warning was clear. It wasn't subtle. "Who are you?" I asked again, my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. "I'm someone who can make sure you never find another thing about Jacob Dawson. You think you know what's going on, Victor, but you don't. And you'd be wise to leave it alone before things get complicated." I could hear the smile in his voice, the kind of smile that promised trouble. I was shaking now, but I held it together. "I'm not scared of you," I said, the words coming out harsher than I had intended. "I'm not scared of anyone." "You will be," the voice replied coldly. "If you continue down this path, you'll regret it." And then the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, my mind racing. I had known things were bad, but I hadn't known they were this bad. I had been playing a game I didn't understand, and now the stakes were higher than I had imagined. Whoever this was, whoever was watching me, wasn't just some thug. They were tied to something much darker, much deeper than I could comprehend. I wasn't sure what to do next. I had wanted answers, but now I was confronted with something more dangerous than just betrayal. This wasn't just about Jacob anymore. This was about survival, the kind of survival I hadn't prepared for. The realization settled in like a stone in my gut. This wasn't just about a cheating wife. This wasn't just about some affair. Elena had become a part of something much bigger than either of us, and I had unknowingly walked straight into it. Jacob Dawson wasn't just an affair partner. He was a player in a world I hadn't known existed, a world where power, money, and connections were everything, and people like me were nothing but pawns. I thought about going to the police. I thought about telling someone what had happened, about everything I had discovered. But then I remembered the voice on the phone, the threat, the cold, controlled warning that I was getting too close. Whoever these people were, they didn't care about the law. They didn't care about right or wrong. They only cared about protecting their own. And I was now in their crosshairs. I couldn't back down. I couldn't stop now. I had already come too far, and if this was the game I was in, I had no choice but to play. But I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't trust anyone, not even Elena. Everything I had once believed was being torn down, piece by piece. This was no longer about love, about betrayal, about marriage. This was about something far darker, and the deeper I went, the more I realized how deeply I had been entangled in it all. There was no turning back now. I spent the days that followed in a haze, piecing together the chaos that had erupted in my life. Every step I took toward the truth felt like a slow crawl through mud, painful and exhausting. My anger had shifted, evolved into something else. It wasn't just about the affair anymore. It was about why. Why had Melissa done this? Why had she walked away so easily without a second thought for everything we had shared? What had really driven her to make the choices she did? I had been so focused on Jacob, on the betrayal that had been so visible, so tangible. But now, sitting in the silence of our home, I realized something. The problem didn't start with him. It didn't even start with her cheating. No, it had started long before. It was a culmination of things I'd never noticed, things I had ignored for too long. I needed to understand her, to understand what had changed in her, and in us, that led her down this path. It was time to look deeper, past the surface. I started with her personal belongings, again. It felt invasive, but I wasn't sure what else to do. This wasn't about her stuff or her space anymore. This was about uncovering a piece of her that had been hidden from me. There had to be something more to this affair than just a fleeting moment of weakness. In the back of her closet, behind an old photo album, I found a small, leather-bound notebook. I hadn't seen it before, but it looked like something she had kept for a long time. My pulse quickened as I flipped it open, reading the first page. It was a journal. It wasn't filled with day-to-day events, but with reflections on our marriage, on her life, on her frustrations. And in those pages, I found it. She had been unhappy for years. Not just with me, not just with our relationship, but with herself. The way she described her feelings, it was like reading the thoughts of someone who had lost their sense of self. She spoke about how the passion had faded, how she had felt neglected, unimportant. There were pages filled with regrets, moments where she had questioned if this was all there was to life. She wrote about her longing for something more, something that sparked joy, that gave her the feeling of being seen, of being truly alive again. I couldn't help but feel like I was staring at the ghost of the woman I had once known. The journal painted a picture I hadn't wanted to see. It wasn't just the routine of life that had worn her down. It was the emotional distance, the growing disconnection between us that I had ignored. My work had consumed me. My focus had been on providing, on keeping the family stable. But in doing so, I had taken for granted the emotional needs of the woman who had once been the center of my world. There it was. The truth. Melissa had been craving something she hadn't found with me. She had found it in Jacob, and that had pulled her away. It wasn't love. It wasn't even about the affair, in the simplest terms. It was about a lack of connection, of passion, of purpose. She had felt invisible, unappreciated, and instead of confronting me, she had turned to someone else to fill the void. I felt a surge of anger mixed with deep sorrow, anger at myself. I should have seen it sooner. But sorrow, too. Sorrow that she had felt so alone, even while I was right there beside her. I hadn't been the husband she needed. I hadn't nurtured her emotional well-being, and I had failed to notice when the bond between us started to unravel. But what struck me the hardest wasn't just the fact that I had failed her as a partner. It was the realization that she had made a decision without even considering me. There was no conversation, no attempt to work through things. She had simply chosen the path of escape. I spent hours poring over the journal, each page heavier than the last. She had written about how she had tried to reach out to me, tried to express her frustration, her need for more, but each time I had brushed it off. I had been so consumed with my own life, with the pressures of work and providing, that I had failed to see her, to hear her. She wasn't just asking for attention. She was asking for a new beginning, for something more meaningful. And then the last entry, written only a few days before she left. It was different. There was no mention of Jacob. Instead, she wrote about how she had made peace with her decision. She had stopped waiting for me to see her, to hear her. She had stopped hoping for things to change and had taken control of her own life. And in that moment, I realized she had already made her decision before Jacob even entered the picture. Jacob was just the catalyst, the trigger that set everything into motion. I was no longer the man she wanted. I had become a fixture in her life, someone who was simply there, but no longer a partner, no longer someone she could turn to for emotional connection. The pain of this realization settled deep in my chest. It wasn't just betrayal anymore. It was the loss of a life I had imagined we'd share forever. A life that, in the end, was only real to me. I stared at the journal, the weight of it too much to bear. This wasn't just about what she had done. This was about what we had both failed to do. We had let it all slip away, little by little, until there was nothing left. I didn't know what to do with this new knowledge. Could I confront her with it? Could I fix this? Or was it too late? What do you think of Victor's journey? Do you believe he will find peace after everything he's uncovered? From which region are you watching this video? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to follow all our stories. And remember, check out more heartwarming tales by clicking here on the end screen.